Hey everyone, I'm your host Damon Garcia, and you're listening to Everyone is Talking About God. And today we're talking about learning and growing and how to evolve, and how people like Rachel Held Evans taught me how to. What's up, everybody? It's Damon, and today it's just me. Just me on this podcast episode. The last couple, we've got to have some amazing conversations with a few of my friends over here on the central coast of California, and it's been great. Before that, we had a whole bunch of interviews, of course. I'm sure some of you have become a part of this little community through some of those interviews. So grateful for you to be here. And yeah, hit me up and let me know kind of what you've been thinking about these different types of episodes. Maybe more of what you want to see, or maybe someone you think would be cool to have on. Anything. I love talking to you guys. Hit me up at whoisdamon on Instagram and Twitter. And of course at God Talk Pod for the podcast, Instagram and Twitter. So grateful for you guys. Now, today's episode, I wanted to talk about something very urgent, which is why I'm just doing this by myself. Couldn't really gather anyone to talk about this stuff with in time for this week's episode. But on Saturday, something happened. On Saturday, a woman named Rachel Held Evans passed away. And this episode is coming out on Monday, so it's very, very recent. Very fresh among the community of people who knew her. Now, if you had no idea who she was, don't worry. This episode is really about change and growth and embracing this path of continuous exploration and learning. And I'm going to be talking about that as a concept, also talking about that in my own life, and talking a bit about Rachel Held Evans and how she was a great example of that type of life and journey for so many people. And Rachel Held Evans, she was this amazing speaker, writer, and friend to so many people. I never got the chance to meet her. I felt like just because of where I came from, where she came from, where everything is headed, I feel like I would have eventually crossed paths with her. Several people that I know have met her, I have also met. And let me give a quick introduction for those who have no idea. She was a writer in what you would call, I guess, this is a little bit difficult to place her into a category, but I think from a secular perspective, they would probably just say she's a part of a progressive Christianity circle. They would probably throw her in there. Others would throw her in a ex-evangelical circle. Others would throw her in maybe even the Episcopal circle, because she ended up joining the Episcopal Church later in life. But really, she has always been in several different circles. She grew up very evangelical in a church that was very fundamentalist in the Bible Belt in Tennessee, and that has kind of shaped the way she communicates eventually. Sorry, I'm kind of skimming ahead, but eventually, as we all do, she faced a season of deconstruction. Why am I saying season? She faced the finally time of deconstruction that sometimes takes over her whole entire life. And she started actually asking questions like so many of us do. And she started to blog about it, and she started to talk to others about it. And her blog grew, and her thoughts and feelings about Christianity continued to change as she tried so hard to fit into evangelicalism. Kind of became a sort of, I guess, a progressive evangelical for a while, until finally she got out. And around the time that she announced her leaving from evangelicalism, I was starting to go through my own questionings and doubts while I was in evangelicalism. And before I talk about how she affected me, let me just skip forward a little bit. She then ended up becoming a voice for so many other people who are leaving church, who are exploring spirituality from a evangelical background or fundamentalist background and are now looking for something more healthier and more justice oriented. And it's funny, some people even called her a voice for a whole generation, which is kind of funny to hear. But if you actually look at all the people influenced by her, all the people that she kind of gave permission to actually explore, you start to see some truth in that statement. And then at 37 years old, last month, she ended up getting this flu and then had a severe allergic reaction to the antibiotics they gave her and then had to be put into a medically induced coma. And I saw on Twitter everyone talking about this and talking about praying for her and waiting for updates. And then on Saturday morning, she ended up passing away. And her husband, Dan Evans, wrote this as a statement to Slate magazine saying, "She put others before herself. She shared her platform. She always remembered how others had helped her. She enjoyed seeing other people in contexts where they thrived. She didn't hold grudges, would forget as well as forgive. She had little time for pettiness and a big heart for people. And these are all things I wish I had told her more while I still had the privilege to keep her company." And I think there's plenty of people who wish they would have told her more while she was still with us. Now, let me tell you a bit of my background and when I first started exploring her writings as well as several other people's writings that kind of all culminated in me questioning absolutely everything. I'm 26 now, but when I was 19, I became exposed to writings of Christians that weren't exactly orthodox, that plenty of other evangelical Christians out there would call, heretics, which is such a funny word to me nowadays. Heretic, heretical, heresy, because it's so often used as a word that we label people that we're scared of. Of course, no evangelical would actually admit that. But when you actually talk to them about these issues that they accuse others for being heretical for talking about the other side about, you realize there's definitely a lot of fear here, isn't there? And I started to read people like, of course, plenty of people. This is their first little taste of heresy, Rob Bell. And I started reading stuff like Love Wins, Velvet Elvis. He was, of course, at one time the evangelical super megastar, and then he started to actually say certain things he believed, which people didn't like. Came out with a book, Love Wins, which questioned the existence of hell, and he lost so many connections and opportunities and people who would show his videos at their church all the time. There's a famous tweet from John Piper, big Calvinist star, who when Rob Bell's book trailer came out, John Piper tweeted, "Farewell, Rob Bell." Classic Piper. And as I got into him, I ended up getting into people like Peter Rollins, who's a radical theologian, people like Brian McLaren, big guy who was really famous for being associated with the Emergent Church and has kind of moved beyond that now, I would say, in my opinion. People like, who else? Phyllis Tickle, Kester Bruin, Barry Taylor, more radical theology guys, some liberation theology guys, some process theology guys. And I just realized how many guys I said. There was definitely some girls too, of course. And that was actually something that really helped me see some things differently too. Because when I first started reading this stuff, I think before I was like, all right, I'm reading a bunch of cool evangelical guys. And then when I stopped reading so much of them, I just moved to reading only progressive guys. And then I realized, oh snap, there's other people too. And so one of the people I found was Rachel Held Evans. And I found her actually because of Rob Bell, because she gave a sermon at Mars Hill Bible Church when Rob Bell was pastoring there. And there was this sermon about her little project that she did, actually a very big project she did, called A Year of Biblical Womanhood. And that was very interesting to me because at the time I was in this evangelical church, this discipleship program, this Bible college environment, this environment where we're involved in every ministry of the church. And I felt very alone because I was looking for the truth. My influence and focus kept getting wider and wider as the authorities around me kept trying to narrow my influence and focus. And one of the things I was thinking a lot about at the time was gender, because I was in an environment where people loved these traditional gender roles. Men do this and act this way, and women do this and act that way. And they're very separated, and that's just how God said it. And it got very strange. There's a lot of pride in the men that I was surrounded by. There was a lot of confusion and questioning from the woman that I was surrounded by. But most of all, there was a lot of just, this is how it is. This is how we do it. This is how God said it. I remember I wrote this blog post about, what was it about? It was about just this simple idea of allowing women to be everything that they wanted to be. And I looked at, in Romans 16, these two women that are mentioned, Tryphania and Tryphosa. Paul gives them a shout out in his list of shout outs. Say hi to them, say hi to them, send my love to that person. And he says Tryphania and Tryphosa, who worked hard for the Lord. And that word work hard there, the Greek there is like literally referring to working, like by the sweat of your brow type work. And Tryphania and Tryphosa are Roman names that mean dainty. And so if you kind of like do some little bit of exegesis and interpretation, you see that most likely what Paul is making reference to here is a story of these two women, probably sisters, who grew up in a very rich, well-off Roman family, giving them names like dainty as a way of saying, I hope this is what you become. That's how they named people. And then they leave, join this Christian community, and end up working. Like that to me is such an interesting story because it shows how we can be born in environments where people say, this is who you are to be, and this is who you have to be. And then something bigger beyond ourselves calls us to more deep and meaningful work. And so I wrote about that, wrote about the power of that. I wrote about how cool I thought that was, talked a little bit about Christian feminism. And then my pastor at the time had like a talk with me, and he asked me, so what was your relationship like with your older brother? He knew I had an older brother that I kind of grew up with. And I told him a little bit, and then he said, did people like kind of view your brother as like stronger than you, or like more of a man than you, or whatever, something like that, some weird questions like that. I was like, what are you talking about? I don't know. And he's like, what about when he joined the army? And I said, what about it? And he said, did you feel like he was stronger than you or more of a man than you? I said, no, not really. I feel like he left skinny and came back chubby. And then I realized like what he was trying to get at was, what traumatic experience happened in your life that you have a problem with traditional gender roles? I had plenty of strange conversations. That's one of them. And so, back to Rachel Held Evans, when I heard that she did a project called A Year of Biblical Womanhood, where she went through all the commandments in the Bible that refer to women should be this way. She did all of those for a year, focused on more like sections of it each month throughout the year, and then wrote a book about it. And to kind of show, hey, so many people are talking about biblical manhood and biblical womanhood and being a biblical man, biblical woman, but do we actually know what the heck we're talking about when we say that? And so, of course, it piqued my interest. And all my friends were wondering why you're reading this book about biblical womanhood and you're not even a woman. But it was about something so much deeper. And yeah, I loved that book. I read it when I was in that environment. And then when she announced that she was leaving from evangelicalism, I remember that was literally the first person that I ever heard about leaving evangelicalism. And that kind of like opened up my view of things a little bit, widened my vision a little bit. I realized, oh, that's like a thing you can do. And when she talked about leaving evangelicalism, it was simply saying, like, I remember the thing I had read. I'm not sure exactly where I read it now, but I remember the thing I was reading was saying, like, they're telling me to be an evangelical, you have to believe this, 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 and this, and this. And how about I just be honest with myself and say, I just don't believe it, so maybe I'm not an evangelical. Instead of trying so hard to be a progressive evangelical or an quote-unquote honest evangelical or liberal evangelical, whatever. Just admit, maybe I just don't belong in this community. I ended up finding one blog she posted about leaving evangelicalism called What Now? And in there she wrote, so rather than wearing out my voice and calling for an end to evangelicalism's culture wars, I think it's time to focus on finding and creating church among its many refugees, women called to ministry, our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, science lovers, doubters, dreamers, misfits, abuse survivors, those who refuse to choose between their intellectual integrity and their faith of their compassion and their religion, those who have, for whatever reason, been farewelled. Instead of fighting for a seat at the evangelical table, I want to prepare tables in the wilderness where everyone is welcome and where we can go on discussing and debating the Bible, science, sexuality, gender, racial reconciliation, justice, church, and faith, but without labels, without wars. So, it's so interesting to think back how influential that was for me, because it opened a whole new road for me to think about. Of course, it would take me years before I ever left evangelicalism, but it was very inspiring for me. Actually, when I started, people always talk about when you do some form of art, whether it's writing or music or poetry or painting, whatever. When you start out, you're usually just copying people that you really look up to. But that's a good part of it. Some people look down on that, or even look down on themselves for doing that. But that's I think, a very necessary part to beginning to get good at your particular craft, because you have to kind of pretend to be people you like until you find your own voice. It can actually help you find your own voice by trying to use other people's voices in a way. And Rachel Held Evans was one of those people for me. When I first started my own blog, I literally formatted my blogs exactly like Rachel Held Evans' blogs, with the things separated in paragraphs and certain paragraphs or sentences in those paragraphs being in bold, and very much like the format of how it began in the middle and the end, how it crescendoed to the end, and then ending with some questions at the end for comments, all that. Yeah, exactly. That's how I learned to blog, by reading Rachel Held Evans' blog. And she was, oh my goodness, so gifted at that. Thinking back, I'm just so impressed, because at a certain point, for years and years and years, she wrote that blog every single day, and there were long blog posts, and she was committed to it and was so gifted at pumping those out every day. And each one was definitely something to get people talking and think about. And she wasn't just how do you say, she wasn't just filling it in. And I would read them every day too at a certain point, and it was inspiring, and it was showing me like there's other ways to think about this stuff, there's other ways to talk about this stuff, and you are not alone. And her, along with several other people I was reading, I remember feeling like I want to talk about this stuff, but no one like in my physical space is talking about this stuff. And so actually what's funny is, as I was writing blogs, I had a friend whose dad was a local pastor and jerk. She looked at my blog and she said, "Oh, this looks like my dad's sermon notes. Like, this is exactly how he writes them." And I remember thinking, what? That's not what I'm going for. So it's possible maybe Rachel Held Evans kind of was inspired by, of course, other people's way of doing things, but I got it from her. So anyway, Rachel Held Evans left evangelicalism. Plenty of other people left and were feeling like they had permission to leave because they were agreeing with a lot of what she was saying. I eventually left, and that is a very, very, very hard thing to do. To grow up in an environment where you're told, this is who we are, this is how we do things, and then to decide, actually, no, this isn't right for me. None of this is right for me. I don't belong here. And then leave. It took me quite a while. I was kind of, for a bit, hoping that I could be one of those people, as they say, who kicks the box open from the inside. People who fight for change from the inside. And then there's people on the outside who kind of call for change from there, among the people who don't belong in there. And I guess I eventually just became that. I think Rachel Held Evans kind of wrestled through that too, of like, which one am I? Am I the person that fights from the inside or from the outside? And what's funny is she ended up being a voice for so many people that were leaving their church and looking for some sort of revolution, some sort of completely different way of doing things, completely new kind of reformation, similar to the Protestant Reformation. And then she ended up joining the Episcopal Church. And what's funny about that is that there's plenty of people who have left evangelicalism with this revolutionary fervor of like, things are different, we're going to change things, everything is changing. And then they just join a church that has been around way longer than evangelicalism, like the Episcopalians or the Anglicans or the Methodists, or who else is there? Disciples of Christ, whoever. And it's interesting because, well, I remember talking to one friend about it, who is someone who has like left evangelicalism and just kept going and kept getting more and more and more radical. Super interesting person. And I remember talking to him about this phenomenon of people just ending up joining mainline denominations. And he was like, yeah, when I heard Rachel Held Evans join the Episcopal Church, I remember thinking, well, of course, I could have easily predicted that because I keep seeing so many other people do that. And I'm not bashing it. I'll talk about the good element of joining a mainline church after leaving evangelicalism in a little bit. But first, why it's kind of strange and funny is because there is a phenomenon, I believe, of people who kind of, like I said, start reading other people, start thinking outside the box, start questioning, start doubting, start going deeper into their faith, realizing the way of Jesus does not match up with the church I'm in. And then they leave and they feel like they're part of this thing. Sometimes it's a group of friends that all leave together, or people that leave separately and then end up becoming friends because they share this feeling of being an ex-evangelical, being an ex-Christian, people who are leaving and looking for the next revolution, the next reformation, the next emergence of whatever religion is headed toward, the future of faith. And then one of your friends says, hey, I found this cool Episcopal church down the road. It's this little building of like 15 old people, but it's super amazing because they're gay affirming, they don't believe in hell, they're affirming of other religions, and it's just super awesome. And they don't have a rock band up front during worship. They do these super deep and cool prayers together. And and then you're like, I thought we were like trying to do something here. What do you mean you joined the Episcopal Church? Now, this is a story I've heard a few times in my journey of meeting different people who have walked away from the faith I grew up in. And it's funny because, like I said, the mainline denominations are way older than evangelicalism. And maybe the reason so many of them wind up being progressive is because they've been around longer than evangelicalism. They've had more time to think and change. Maybe just a theory based off nothing. But I see that there's a lot of disappointment in some people when they feel like they're part of a revolution, and then the people who are in that revolution end up just joining a mainline church. And I get it. I totally get it. I'm kind of one of those people. I actually was one of the people that joined an Episcopal church. I went to one after I left evangelicalism for about a year, and then I stopped. But I think the thing that's important to pay attention to is that these mainline churches that are, even though they're progressive, they still have some changing to do as well. There's a lot of work still to be done. And now back to me saying I'm not bashing. The reason I say that is because Rachel Held Evans was different. And I believe if we would have given her more time, she already was starting to kind of, she wasn't just someone who joined the Episcopal Church and said, oh, this is what I've been looking for all this time, I'm good now. But she was still pulling all of Christianity forward. I literally feel like that about her work. She was still pulling everyone forward, even within the mainline denomination. And I think if she was given more time, she would have did that on a way bigger and public level, where maybe she eventually would have left Episcopalianism as well, and in a similar fashion. But yeah, it's so interesting to think about this idea of constantly learning and changing and growing, even if that means it forcing you out of communities that you initially thought you would be in forever, or that you initially thought was gonna give you all the opportunities you ever dreamed of. Recently, yesterday actually, I was at the store and I walked by this guy that I hadn't seen in years, and he told me, hey, what's up? And he's like, yeah, I actually listen to your podcast. And he said, yeah, I like some of the stuff that you're saying, and it seems like you were a part of this church and then kind of, I don't remember his exact wording, but it was something like you went too far, and that's like you question things, you went too far, and that's why you're not a part of that anymore. That was his interpretation of events based on the stuff I talk about on this podcast. And it was interesting for me to hear, because my understanding of it isn't exactly that. Isn't exactly like I was too heretical and I had to get out, or I was too heretical and they had to push me out. But I very much feel like I just wanted to keep growing. I just wanted to keep going deeper and deeper into this spiritual journey and this Jesus path and this God chasing that I'm on. I've talked about before how plenty of the disagreements I have with evangelicalism as a whole is things like, of course, belief in a literal hell. I've given up on reading the Bible literally. I've given up on rejecting all these other faiths as like demonic paths. I've given up on what else? Oh, and of course, rejecting LGBTQ people, I've given up on. And I got there not because I was trying to just, as some people think, compromise with the world or trying to just be different or whatever. I got there by using the tools that I was given even in the evangelical world. Like, for example, there's a whole exegetical method within the denomination I grew up in that is used to interpret the verses that seem to be against women preaching. The denomination I grew up in is very much for women preaching and being in leadership. And when you look at the verses that seem to be against it, you have to read it in context, realize the history of it, realize that the role of women was way different in the first century church, and then realize that it is talking about certain women in a certain time and things are different, and then look at other verses such as the ones that say the Spirit of God will fall on all men and women, and in Christ there is no male nor female, stuff like that, and use that to get you to a new place. If you use that same exact method on the verses that seem to be against LGBT people, you get to the same place that I'm talking about, that you realize, oh, what we now know as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people today did not exist in that time. They're talking about certain groups of people for a certain reason at a certain time, and then look at other verses about God getting his people to embrace people who we previously thought weren't in. And then, of course, another thing, the founder of the denomination I grew up in was super all about interdenominational ministry. And if you take that to its logical end, that leads you to embrace interfaith ministry as well. So that's just a couple things that I'm talking about when I say I was given these tools and I just kept going with them. It's like they give you these tools, but there's boundaries to make sure you don't go too far. And I just wanted to keep going. I just wanted to keep learning and keep growing. And I outgrew the community I was in. And it pains me that there's so many spiritual communities out there that encourage growth but set up boundaries to stop too much growth. It's really sad. And that's something that people like Rachel Held Evans was a great example of. This constant growth, this constant learning. Somebody pointed out on Twitter how it's very important to pay attention to, among all these people who are mourning Rachel Held Evans' loss, there's plenty of people of color, minorities, LGBTQ people, and not just a bunch of white people. Like, since Rachel Held Evans was a white woman from this Bible Belt. And the reason that it was like that is because she constantly was open to what God is doing, the future of faith, the future of Christianity. She was constantly giving her platform to voices of minorities. And it's so important, if you're going to be in this conversation about spirituality and the future of faith and God and religion and all that, to be open to what we're all headed toward. It's very unclear. Every religion right now is in a major shift, and it is very unclear exactly what that shift is going to turn out. But 100 years from now, they're probably going to be able to explain it pretty well. But right now, we're just in it. And yeah, you'd think this idea of like learning and growing would be so basic and simple to so many people, but it pains me to realize that it's not. Richard Rohr, another author that had helped me along my journey open up and still helps me today, he wrote once this quote. I'm trying to remember it, but I remember it because I've quoted it plenty of times to people and in sermons myself. The quote is, frequently the biggest obstacle to the next experience of God is the last experience of God. And I love that quote so much because so often we think our purpose is to find this conception of God and then just cling on to it for the rest of our lives. When so often we need to keep going. We need to realize in order to embrace the new, we need to let go of the old, even if the old includes so much good. Even if the old got you to the place you're at today, you need to become grateful for that, embrace it, and then let it go, and be able to welcome in the new. And I've said this, I think, in the last couple episodes. I keep saying it, but it's staying on my mind, and I've even been saying it in plenty of conversations too, this idea that we're realizing that so many people are still teaching that the purpose of life is to find the answers and then spend the rest of your life sharing those answers with others. It's the concept of evangelism. It's the concept of neoliberalism. It's the concept of so many of these communities and paths and worldviews and ideologies. Find all the answers. Then once you find them, spend the rest of your life sharing them with everybody else. But that doesn't work and it falls apart. Because to ever think that we're in a place where we've found the answers is extremely arrogant and ignorant and just ridiculous. But also to think that that's even possible, that there is an end to this exploration and searching and learning and growing is also ridiculous. And we have to pay attention when we realize, like, for example, within Christianity, when Jesus says, go out into the world and make disciples, disciples are students. He's telling people, invite people on this journey of constantly learning and growing as you continue to learn and grow and change. This isn't learning and growing within the same worldview. This isn't, my spiritual community says these are all the truths and I'm going to spend the rest of my life learning this list of truths. No, that's being open to wherever truth may be. Also in 1 Corinthians 3, when Paul is writing to the church in Corinth about how they're arguing with each other, saying, I follow the Christian teacher Paul, I follow the Christian teacher Apollos, I follow Peter. He's saying, come on, we're all on the same side. And then he says, whether it's Paul or Apollos or Peter or life or death or the world or the present or the future, all things are yours. And the reason all things are yours is because you are of Christ and you are of God, which is a radically different view than so many modern day Christians spew out, which is this idea that because you are a Christian, you can only search for truth in this limited amount of resources. When Paul in 1 Corinthians says, actually, because you are a Christian, you are to search for truth everywhere. Because all things are yours. I'm also reminded of the famous Zen saying in that book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. I think it's like the first line of the first page, which is this quote that in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are only a few. And I love that quote, and that's really driven me on my journey as well. That to be able to approach life and theology and philosophy and history and politics and all these discussions as a beginner, with a beginner's mind, with an open and curious and wondering mind. There are so many possibilities, but when we approach these with the expert's mind, with the I know exactly what I'm talking about, I know every which way about this issue, and I will shut up anyone who tries to get me to learn something about this, of course, there are barely any possibilities there. Of course. So, this was pretty rambly, ranty podcast that I think I pretty much got out what I wanted to get out. But most importantly, like I said, there's so many amazing people out there to read and learn from and discuss with. Do not be limited to a small few circle of influences and resources. You are free to explore. And that's hopefully what I want to do with this podcast, is to continue to talk about all these ways to explore this stuff, all these ways to talk about God, give people freedom to explore for themselves. And remember to have a beginner's mind, my friends. Thank you for listening. Like I said, hit me up. Let me know what you've been thinking about these episodes. Let me know if you want to talk about stuff, whatever. @whoisDamon is my Instagram and Twitter, and @GodTalkPod for the podcast. And if you want to find out more about Rachel Held Evans, you could just do a simple Google search of Rachel Held Evans. But also on Twitter, a lot of people have been sharing their own stories and the ways that they've been influenced by her under the hashtag because of RHE. So plenty and plenty of stories there, more about her influence. And she has plenty of books. And it's really a bummer because it's like her most recent book that just came out this year called Inspired, about the Bible, has just been like sitting on my bookshelf. And I'm like, been thinking, yeah, I'll get to that eventually. And now she's gone. And it's interesting when somebody like this is gone, how you realize, oh man, I really need to get more into their stuff. Somebody posted on Twitter too, how they saw that all her books are like now on the bestsellers list, because people are actually with probably the same mindset I had. People who are thinking, oh yeah, I'll get to her stuff eventually, are like, no, we have to now. So it's really cool to see that, because she's an amazing voice for everyone on this journey of exploring their own spirituality and talking about God. So anyway, thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Love you all. Bye-bye.